What's up, algebra class? Before we begin, make sure you have your notebook and something to write with. 7.21, why do we use the quadratic formula? What is the quadratic formula? You've already learned two methods that are used to find the solutions or roots of a quadratic equation. The quadratic formula is our third method. Let's take a look at what the quadratic formula looks like. The quadratic formula uses the numbers a, b, and c from the quadratic equation in order to find the roots. We read the quadratic equation as x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. In this lesson, we will not be using the quadratic formula. The focus of this lesson is to understand when you need to use the quadratic formula. When do we use this formula? There are two situations when we use the quadratic formula. Situation 1, you can't fill in the blanks with two numbers. Let's take a look at this quadratic equation. 0 equals x squared plus 7x plus 9. In order to find the roots, I first have to fill in the blanks. Well, there aren't two numbers that multiply to 9 and add to 7. Because I can't fill in the blanks, I would have to use the quadratic formula. Situation 2, the leading coefficient is not equal to 1. In this quadratic equation, 0 equals to 2x squared plus 7x plus 9. My leading coefficient in purple is 2. Because the leading coefficient is not equal to 1, we would use the quadratic formula. Let's take a look at Miss Franks' mini lesson.
No verse, quit asking. What's poppin'? Brand new whip, just hopped in. I got options.
Welcome back to our remote learning classroom. I can't believe that after today, we only have next week to learn together. I'm super duper sad, even though I bet you guys are super happy. So let's really make the next couple of lessons count. Today is lesson 7.21, and you just learned what the quadratic formula is, and I'm going to explain why we need to use the quadratic formula. You've already learned two ways to find the roots. One way is graphically. The second way is algebraically by factoring. Now you're learning a third way, which is the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula uses the a, b, and c from the quadratic equation. If you plug it into this formula, bam, pop out the roots. When should you use the quadratic formula? There are two instances when you should use the quadratic formula. The first instance is when you cannot fill in the blanks and factor the quadratic equation. Let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at this quadratic. Y equals to x squared plus 4x plus 1. I want to find the roots, so I'm going to jump right into factoring. I'm going to set up my fill in the blanks. I need two numbers that multiply to 1 and that add to 4. Well, the only two numbers that are going to multiply to 1 is 1 times 1. And 1 plus 1 is never going to give me a 4. So I'm not going to be able to fill in these blanks. But this quadratic equation does cross the x-axis and has roots. This is when I'm going to want to use the quadratic formula. If we can't fill in the blanks, then we're going to use the quadratic formula. Let's take a look at another example. In my bottom quadratic equation, I have x squared plus 6x plus 8. And I can think of two numbers that multiply to 8 and add to 6. Those numbers would be 2 and 4. So this equation I can factor. And you've factored this type of equation before. And I'm not sure if you noticed this, but all of the quadratic equations that you've factored have an imaginary 1. And this is our leading coefficient. So when the leading coefficient is 1, and you can think of the numbers that multiply to the c term and add to the b term, you can factor it. You can fill in your blanks. But let's take a look at this example above it. Y equals to 2x squared plus 6x plus 1. Our leading coefficient is not 1, it's 2. When our leading coefficient is not 1, we want to use the quadratic formula. So for this example, where the leading coefficient is 1, we can factor. You know how to factor. You fill in your blanks. But for this example, where the leading coefficient is not a 1, it's a 2, it could be a 3, it could be a 1.5, it could be a negative 3. If your leading coefficient is not 1, you guessed it, you're using the quadratic formula. We're going to use the quadratic formula. So to recap, there are 2 instances where we're going to use the quadratic formula. 1, when we can't factor. If we can't fill in the blanks, it doesn't mean the quadratic equation doesn't have roots. It means we can't use that strategy and we're going to use the quadratic formula. The second instance is when the leading coefficient is not a 1. So for today's classwork, you're going to be looking at different quadratic equations and asking yourself, can I fill in the blanks and factor this? Or do I need to use the quadratic formula? Your turn. Ms. Franks is solving the quadratic equation y equals 3x squared plus 4x plus 1. Should she use the quadratic formula to find the roots? Why or why not? Great job. Ms. Franks should use the quadratic formula to find the roots because the leading coefficient is a 3 instead of a 1. Classwork. I hope you enjoyed this meme that I created for you. Today you are completing 7.21 classwork. You will be completing this classwork on a Google form. If you need any assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. You got this.